if I handed you a single magical penny today, and I told you that its value would double every single day for the next 31 days, or, on the other hand, I offered you $3 million in cold, hard cash right this very second, which one would you actually take?
I mean, let's be completely honest with ourselves here.
Right. Because if you take the penny, by day 10, you've waited a full third of the month and you have exactly $5.12.
Yeah, it's nothing.
It is nothing.
Yeah.
And by day 20, so you are 2/3 the way through this grand experiment, you're sitting on roughly $5,000.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the person who took the cash has been living like absolute royalty for 3 weeks.
Oh, for sure. If you're the one holding that penny, you are experiencing just profound, agonizing regret. You feel like a total fool.
You really do. And welcome to Audiobook Mode. Today we're doing a deep dive into an audio overview of a concept that completely rewires how we think about success.
Yeah, and that feeling of looking like a fool, that's actually the exact cognitive barrier that prevents most people from achieving anything monumental in their lives.
Because if you can just endure that psychological friction until day 29, the math finally catches up, right?
Exactly. You hit $2.7 million, and then on day 30, it's $5.3 million.
Wow.
And by day 31, that single, seemingly worthless penny explodes into over $10.7 million. You completely eclipse the $3 million cash payout.
But the tragedy of human behavior is that, well, almost no one have the biological or psychological endurance to hold that penny for those first 29 days of invisible growth.
No, they really don't.
So today we are dissecting the exact opposite of the modern, what you might call the microwave mentality. We're exploring the timeless, unshakable principles from Darren Hardy's book, The Compound Effect.
Which is, I mean, it's essentially an operator's manual for success.
Right. Our mission in this deep dive is to look under the hood of human behavior. We aren't just going to list off motivational platitudes about, working hard. We want to examine the physiological, the psychological, and the neurological mechanisms of why long-term consistency feels so incredibly unnatural to us.
Yeah, and more importantly, how we can effectively hack our own operating systems to bypass that resistance.
Exactly. We want to equip you with the practical tools to track, build, and accelerate your progress without succumbing to the noise of overnight breakthrough fantasies. So, okay, let's unpack this. Why is the penny example so difficult for us to execute in reality?
Well, to understand that, we really have to look at how our brains evolved. I mean, for hundreds of thousands of years, our survival depended entirely on immediate returns.
Like finding food.
Right. If a hunter-gatherer found a high-calorie food source, the biological imperative was to consume it immediately. There's absolutely no concept of a 401k or a 10-year fitness plan.
Yeah, they weren't thinking about retirement.
Exactly. So our brains develop this incredibly strong bias toward immediate gratification. It's a concept behavioral economists call hyperbolic discounting.
Hyperbolic discounting.
Yeah. We inherently view a reward today as far more valuable than a significantly larger reward in the future. In fact, functional MRI scans actually show that when we're asked to think about our future selves.
Like the version of us 10 or 20 years from now.
Yeah, that version. The brain regions that light up are the exact same ones that activate when we think about a complete stranger.
Wait, really? A stranger?
Yes. Neurologically speaking, we don't even identify with that person.
So we're biologically wired to basically steal from our future selves because we treat them like a stranger who owes us a favor.
That's exactly it. It completely reframes the narrative, right? It's not just that you lack discipline. It's that you are actively fighting millions of years of evolutionary programming that is just screaming at you, take the $3 million right now.
Wow. And that evolutionary mismatch, that's what creates what the book calls the illusion of inactivity.
Right. When you start a new habit, say going to the gym or saving money, you are in those first 20 days of the penny's growth.
Here you're only making $5.
Yeah. You are putting in highly visible effort, but the external environment provides zero visible feedback.
Which is so frustrating.
It is. And your brain, which craves that immediate caloric or social return on investment, it registers this as a massive failure. It assumes the energy expenditure is wasted.
And the book uses this really brilliant narrative construct to illustrate how this biological blind spot plays out in modern life. It involves three friends, Larry, Scott, and Brad.
I love this example.
Yeah, it's so relatable. So they're identical in almost every demographic metric. They live in the same neighborhood. They make roughly $50,000 a year. They're all married. And they all have that standard, slightly sluggish baseline of average health.
Right. They are standing at the exact same starting line.
So Larry He represents the baseline. He chooses to do absolutely nothing different.
He just coasts.
Exactly. He doesn't adopt any destructive new vices, but he doesn't implement any positive habits either. Just existing. Then you have Scott.
And Scott is the penny.
Yes. Scott decides to introduce a series of micro changes. These are not sweeping New Year's resolution style overhauls. He commits to reading just 10 pages of a good book every day.
Which takes what, 10, 15 minutes?
Barely. And he listens to 30 minutes of educational audio during his commute instead of the radio. And crucially, he cuts exactly 125 calories from his daily diet.
And let's be precise about what 125 calories actually looks like.
It is practically nothing.
It's nothing. It is switching from mayonnaise to mustard on a sandwich. It's skipping one single can of soda. The friction required to make this change is almost zero.
Right. And then there's Brad. So Brad leans into our biological preference for comfort.
The $3 million cash guy.
Exactly. He buys a larger television to maximize his leisure time. He begins experimenting with slightly richer, heavier recipes he sees online. And he adds just one extra alcoholic beverage to his weekly routine.
And again, these are not catastrophic downward spirals. Brad hasn't developed a severe addiction. He hasn't gambled away his life savings. He has simply increased his comfort baseline by a microscopic margin.
So if we fast forward 5 months, what do we see?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing. You could put Larry, Scott, and Brad in a room, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish any difference in their weight, their intellect, or their marital happiness.
10 months go by. Still nothing.
The illusion of inactivity is holding strong.
Yeah. Scott is reading his 10 pages, Brad is watching his shows, and Larry is just existing. It isn't until month 18 that you even begin to detect the slightest divergence in their trajectories.
But when we reach month 31, which, perfectly mirrors day 31 in our compounding penny model, the mathematics of their choices violently manifests.
It's explosive.
It really is. Over those 31 months, Brad's slight increase in daily caloric intake has compounded into a 33.5-pound weight gain.
Wow.
And Scott's imperceptible daily deficit of 125 calories has resulted in a 33.5-pound weight loss.
So between Brad and Scott, there is now a staggering 67-pound disparity, just from mustard instead of mayo.
And it doesn't stop at physical weight. Because Scott was reading 10 pages a day and listening to 30 minutes of audio, he has accumulated nearly 1,000 hours of intellectual capital.
Which changes how he operates entirely.
Absolutely. He's applied those new mental models at work, he secured a promotion, and the psychological momentum has just invigorated his marriage.
Whereas Brad, conversely, is suffering. The weight gain has impacted his sleep architecture. The poor sleep makes him irritable at work, which stalls his career. His irritability bleeds into his home life, and his marriage is deeply strained.
And Larry is exactly where he was, only now he's harboring this low-grade bitterness that the universe hasn't magically rewarded him.
What is critical to extract from this is the timeline. 31 months.
That's nearly 3 years.
It's 3 years of sustained behavioral change before the definitive, undeniable results materialized. Most individuals who attempt to be Scott, they abandon the protocol by month 3.
Because their hyperbolic discounting mechanism overrides their logical goals.
Right. They step on the scale after skipping the soda for 90 days, they see no dramatic shift, and they conclude the system is broken.
But let me challenge that slightly. If we know that the human brain relies on immediate feedback loops, and we know that the modern world is fundamentally engineered to exploit that, from infinite scroll algorithms to overnight shipping, are we basically asking people to fight a losing war against their own neurology?
That's a great point.
How do we expect someone to endure 31 months of delayed gratification when their environment is relentlessly bombarding them with instant dopamine hits?
Well, we don't ask them to fight their neurology. We ask them to construct an environment that bypasses it entirely. We have to shift our focus from the monumental outcomes to the microscopic inputs.
Okay, microscopic impact.
Yeah. The compound effect is essentially the law of gravity applied to human behavior. It is always running, but what exactly is it compounding? It isn't compounding your desires or your goals. It is exclusively compounding your choices.
Which brings up this amazing concept from the source material. Elephants versus mosquitoes.
Yes, I love this analogy.
We go through life obsessively terrified of being bitten by an elephant. We are paralyzed by the fear of making a massive catastrophic error, bankrupting a company, committing a fatal career mistake, destroying a relationship in one dramatic blowout.
We spend massive amounts of cognitive bandwidth guarding against these massive failures.
But the reality is, you don't get bitten by elephants.
No, you get bitten by mosquitoes.
Exactly. It's the small, invisible, highly repetitive choices that drain the lifeblood out of your potential.
And the muffin effect is the perfect clinical illustration of that mosquito bite. Let's look at Brad's trajectory with a higher degree of physiological rigor, because it wasn't just the mathematical accumulation of calories that caused his life to fracture.
Right, it was a biochemical cascade.
Exactly. Brad eats a highly processed sugary muffin. This causes an immediate aggressive spike in his blood glucose levels.
I don't know what happens.
His pancreas overcompensates by dumping insulin into his bloodstream, which rapidly clears the glucose, leading to reactive hypoglycemia. Basically, a brutal blood sugar crash.
And when your blood sugar crashes, your brain perceives it as an acute survival threat.
Right. It releases cortisol, the stress hormone, and adrenaline. You become physiologically agitated.
So he's jittery and stressed from a muffin.
Yes, and this chemical dysregulation ruins Brad's sleep architecture that night. He doesn't enter deep, restorative REM sleep, so he wakes up cognitively impaired and emotionally brittle. Because his prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and impulse control, is fatigued, he snaps at his boss over a minor inconvenience.
And then his boss reprimands him.
Exactly. Brad absorbs this status threat, elevating his cortisol even further. He comes home vibrating with stress and just withdraws from his wife.
And his wife perceives the withdrawal as a rejection, which triggers her own stress response.
Over 31 months, this daily cycle of micro-frictions erodes the structural integrity of the marriage. It wasn't an affair or a massive betrayal. It was the compounding physiological consequence of a daily muffin.
That is terrifying when you map out the causality. Like a bag of chips eaten out of sheer boredom, or 2 hours of algorithmic social media consumption instead of prepping for a morning meeting. Those are the mosquitoes.
They're everywhere.
And if the mosquitoes are that pervasive, the only effective prophylactic is absolute, ruthless ownership of your choices. The source material advocates for a major paradigm shift regarding personal responsibility, particularly in relationships.
Yeah, the standard societal trope is that a healthy relationship is a 50-50 proposition. You meet halfway.
But the author argues that relationships, and life in general, are fundamentally 100-0. You must give 100% ownership with zero expectation of return.
The mathematical problem with a 50-50 mindset is that you are constantly calculating your partner's contribution. You are constantly searching for deficits to justify your own lack of effort.
You surrender your agency to someone else's behavior.
Taking 100% responsibility means operating with an internal locus of control. You decide that your reactions, your effort, and your emotional state are entirely generated by you, regardless of external stimuli.
But wait, taking 100% ownership has to have a limit, doesn't it? Let's look at the author's own story. He talks about the University of Hard Knocks, where he invested $330,000 into a startup, and his business partner completely mismanaged the funds, effectively blowing the entire investment.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow.
To say he has to take 100% ownership of someone else's financial malpractice, isn't there a danger of toxic self-blame there? How do we separate operational ownership from emotional self-flagellation?
That is a critical distinction. Taking 100% ownership is not about assigning moral fault. It is about reclaiming strategic power.
Okay, how so?
The author didn't say, I'm a bad person because my partner stole the money. He said, I am responsible for the environment that allowed the money to be stolen.
I see.
He acknowledged that he failed to conduct rigorous background checks. He failed to establish structural oversight of the accounts. He ignored the behavioral red flags. If he blames his partner entirely, he learns nothing, and he remains vulnerable to being defrauded again. By taking 100% responsibility for the systemic failures, he ensures he has the power to never repeat the mistake. Blame is about the past. Ownership is about the future.
The psychological shift that occurs when you implement that level of ownership is profound. There's an anecdote regarding a Thanksgiving journal that perfectly captures this cognitive rewiring.
Oh, this is a powerful story.
A man was in a severely deteriorating marriage. He harbored deep resentment toward his wife, just constantly cataloging her flaws and failures. He blamed her entirely for his unhappiness. But he initiated an experiment in 100% ownership.
What did he do?
For one entire year, every single day, he forced himself to identify and write down one specific thing he appreciated about her in a journal. It could be as mundane as how she organized the kitchen or a specific way she interacted with their pets.
And we really must look at the neuroscience of what he was doing here. He was actively battling his brain's confirmation bias. When you decide someone is a source of frustration, your brain's reticular activating system filters out any data to the contrary. You literally become blind to their positive traits.
Exactly. And by forcing himself to write down a daily positive observation, he gave his brain a new mandate. At the end of the year, he presented the journal to his wife, and she was deeply moved.
But the actual transformation occurred entirely within his own neurology, didn't it?
Yes. Over those 365 days, his perception of his wife was fundamentally rewritten. By searching for the good, he began to feel genuine affection again. That acceptance altered his tone of voice, his body language, and his patience.
Which naturally elicited a warmer, more receptive response from her, creating a positive feedback loop.
He took 100% ownership of his perception, and in doing so, he unilaterally engineered the salvation of his marriage.
When you strip away the external excuses, when you stop blaming the traffic for your tardiness, the economy for your financial stagnation, or your partner for your mood, you transition from a passive consumer of your life to the active architect of it. And this is the precise moment where you gain the capacity to engineer your own luck.
The idea of engineering luck is fascinating because the general consensus is that luck is a localized phenomenon. People look at highly successful individuals and dismiss their achievements as random chance. Oh, they were just in the right place at the right time. But if you are operating with an internal locus of control, you realize that blind luck is a terrible strategy. The sources provide an actual equation for engineering luck: preparation plus attitude plus opportunity plus action.
Let's define those variables because it's brilliant. Preparation is the continuous, unglamorous accumulation of skills, knowledge, and resources. Attitude is the psychological readiness to identify potential. Opportunity is the actual external event, which statistically occurs in everyone's life with surprising frequency.
And action is the immediate aggressive capitalization on the event.
Exactly. Richard Branson is a prime example. He freely admits he is lucky, but he also notes that opportunity surrounds everyone constantly. The differentiator is that Branson has spent decades aggressively preparing his capital, his networks, and his risk tolerance so that when an opportunity materializes, he can execute within hours.
Contrast that with the hypothetical Joseph Wallington mentioned in the book. The reason we don't know who Joseph Wallington is because when the exact same opportunity knocked on his door, his skills were outdated, his attitude was cynical, and he hesitated.
The luck passed him by and found the prepared individual.
But how do we guarantee we are prepared? How do we ensure our attitude is calibrated?
It requires a level of ruthless self-awareness that most people find profoundly uncomfortable. And the ultimate mechanism for forcing this awareness is the implementation of a tracking scorecard.
This is where the friction really gets introduced. The author shares a story from his early 20s. He was generating significant revenue in real estate, but when tax season arrived, he owed $100,000 and had zero liquidity.
Ouch.
The money had simply evaporated through 1,000 invisible microtransactions. His accountant gave him a brutal diagnosis. He was digging his financial grave with his own wallet.
So what was the prescription?
For 30 days, he had to carry a physical pocket notebook and manually write down every single penny he spent.
Whether it was a highly negotiated real estate contract or 50 cents for air at a gas station, the physical act of documentation was mandatory. And we need to analyze why this works.
Please do.
In the modern economy, corporations spend billions of dollars on user interface designed to eliminate friction. One-click purchasing, contactless payments, auto-renewing subscriptions. These are all designed to bypass your prefrontal cortex and allow your impulsive basal ganglia to execute the transaction without critical thought. You are literally sleepwalking through your consumption.
Tracking is the deliberate reintroduction of cognitive friction. When you have to pull out a notebook and write down the purchase, you are forcing a System 2 cognitive intervention. You are waking up the logical, analytical part of your brain and forcing it to evaluate a System 1 impulsive desire.
Suddenly, the author found himself abandoning purchases, not because he lacked the funds, but because the psychological friction, the sheer annoyance and microscopic shame of having to document a frivolous purchase outweighed the momentary dopamine hit of acquiring it.
This friction is the only effective defense against the compounding cost of small indulgences. The classic example is the daily $4 coffee. If you calculate the opportunity cost taking, that $4 a day, which is roughly $120 a month, and investing it in the standard index fund over 20 years, it compounds to over $51,000.
You are functionally trading a future luxury vehicle for a daily dose of flavored caffeine.
The analytical question tracking forces you to ask is this $50 item today worth sacrificing $250 of my future financial security?
And it isn't just theory. Look at Kathleen, an executive assistant mentioned in the sources. She was earning $40,000 a year and felt entirely trapped by her financial reality. She believed she had zero surplus capital.
So what did she do?
Her mentor challenged her to track her spending and locate just $33 a month to save, which is less than 1% of her gross income. By tracking her expenses, she identified the invisible leaks. She began bringing her lunch to work one day a week to generate the $33.
And the psychological momentum of that small victory shifted her identity.
Yes. The next month, she eliminated her cable television, saving an additional 2%. Then she audited her subscriptions and altered her coffee habits.
The compounding effect of those micro-adjustments snowballed dramatically. Within 2 years, she wasn't just saving 10% of her income. Her enhanced financial literacy allowed her to negotiate a compensation structure based on company savings and revenue generation.
She ultimately escalated her earning power to over $250,000 a year and amassed $1 million in net assets, all of it cascading from the initial friction of tracking $33.
Jillian Michaels, the fitness expert, equates this to the childhood game of searching for a hidden object. Every single micro choice you make either makes you warmer, moving you fractionally closer to your ultimate objective, or colder, pushing you further into the abyss of your default state.
Okay, but if you're listening to this on your commute right now, you might be rolling your eyes. You might be thinking, look, my life is already stressful enough. Between emails, kids, and keeping the house clean, I barely have the cognitive bandwidth to remember my own passwords. Writing down every single penny, every single calorie, every single minute of screen time, doesn't that make life incredibly rigid? Doesn't tracking turn you into a neurotic robot?
That is the most common and perhaps the most dangerous misconception about discipline. We equate structure with imprisonment. But let's look at the reality of the untracked life.
Right.
When you are unconsciously spending, unconsciously eating, and unconsciously scrolling, you are not free. You are a biological puppet being manipulated by marketers, algorithms, and your own unexamined evolutionary impulses. You are entirely reactive.
So the tracking isn't a prison, it's the alarm clock that wakes you up from the matrix.
Exactly. The magic of tracking is not in its complexity. It is literally just ink on paper. The magic is in the relentless consistency of awareness. Consider the operations of a Las Vegas casino or an Olympic training facility.
Oh, that's a brilliant comparison.
How do casinos engineer mathematically guaranteed profits? They track every single card, every chip, every dealer rotation. How do Olympic athletes secure gold medals? By margins of 1/100th of a second. They track their macronutrients to the gram, their sleep cycles to the minute, their biomechanical outputs to the watt.
You absolutely cannot master what you refuse to measure. Tracking provides the raw data required to reclaim your agency.
All right, let's say we start tracking. The spotlight is on. We look at the notebook and the data is horrific. We see the hours lost to algorithmic rabbit holes. We see the late night caloric binges. We see the financial leaks. Knowing a habit is destructive doesn't magically neutralize it. If I know smoking is bad, my lungs don't instantly heal. How do we actually dismantle these behaviors once the tracking exposes them?
To dismantle a habit, we must first understand the structural integrity of how it is built within the brain. Psychologists estimate that up to 95% of everything we think, feel, and do is governed by habit.
95%.
Yes. Every time you execute a behavior, your brain wraps the corresponding neural pathway in a fatty substance called myelin. This myelin sheath acts like insulation on an electrical wire, allowing the signal to travel faster and with less energy expenditure. Over time, the pathway becomes a superhighway.
Which is why the sources use the analogy of a tree sapling. If a habit is newly formed, say you've been doom scrolling before bed for a week, it's like a tiny sapling. The roots are shallow, the myelin is thin. You can reach down and pluck it out of your routine with minimal effort.
Right. But if you have been executing a bad habit for 10 years, it is a massive, deeply rooted oak tree. The neural superhighway is highly efficient. You cannot simply decide to pull it out.
And this is where the concept of willpower completely fails us. Willpower is an executive function of the prefrontal cortex. It requires immense metabolic energy, primarily blood glucose. As you make decisions throughout the day, your willpower depletes.
Trying to stop a 10-year-old, heavily myelinated habit with sheer willpower is like placing a paper napkin over a picnic basket and expecting it to stop a charging grizzly bear. By 8 p.m., when your willpower is exhausted, the bear is going to tear right through the napkin.
So if willpower is biologically insufficient, what is the alternative? The sources introduce the concept of why power. Let's break this down with an analogy that really clarifies the distinction. Imagine I place a standard wooden plank, 10 inches wide and 30 feet long, flat on the ground. I offer you $20 to walk across it.
You do it instantly. The risk is zero. The reward is immediate.
But if we take that exact same wooden plank and suspend it between the rooftops of 200-story skyscrapers with a crosswind howling, and I offer you the same $20 to walk across it.
You wouldn't take a single step.
Exactly. The physical obstacle, the 10-inch plank, has not changed 1 millimeter. But the context of risk has escalated, and your motivation, $20, is profoundly insufficient to overcome the psychological terror.
However, if you look across that 100-story drop and see that the opposing skyscraper is engulfed in flames and your child is trapped on the roof and that plank is the only bridge,
you wouldn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. You wouldn't ask for the $20. You would sprint across that chasm. The physical danger didn't change. The wind didn't stop. What fundamentally shifted was your why. When the why is sufficiently powerful, the how becomes a trivial logistical detail.
Finding that level of why power requires deep introspection, and it isn't always rooted in positive sunshine and rainbows altruism. Often the most potent, visceral fuel is found in what we despise.
Really?
Yeah. We are culturally conditioned to feel guilty if our motivation stems from a desire to prove detractors wrong or a fierce competitive anger. But having an enemy can be a highly effective psychological catalyst.
Pete Carroll, the legendary football coach, is a perfect case study. For his entire early career, he was dismissed. He was told he was too small, too unorthodox, fundamentally unsuited for elite competition. He didn't just ignore that criticism, he weaponized it.
That deep-seated frustration became the why power that drove his obsessive preparation.
Or consider Anthony Hopkins. As a child, he was labeled with dyslexia, ADHD, and dismissed by educators as a problem child entirely devoid of potential. He harbored a profound anger at being discarded. He utilized that resentment as the high-octane fuel to master his craft and become one of the preeminent actors of his generation. Sometimes your fight is your most valuable asset.
Once you have identified that deep emotional why, you can deploy specific strategic protocols to dismantle the neural pathways of bad habits. The sources identify 5 tactical approaches. First, identify your triggers.
Because habits operate on a cue routine reward loop.
Exactly. You must become a forensic investigator of your own life. Who are you with? What time is it? And what is your emotional state when the craving hits? Second, clean house. You cannot out-willpower your environment. If you want to eliminate processed sugar, you must physically remove it from your domicile.
Third is the strategy of the swap. This is crucial because you can't just delete a habit. The brain demands a replacement behavior for the cue. If your cue is stress and your routine is eating a massive hot fudge sundae, you swap the routine. You eat 2 dark chocolate squares instead.
You satisfy the brain's demand for a chemical reward, but you drastically reduce the physiological damage.
Fourth is deciding the withdrawal method. Ease in versus jump in. Depending on the habit, gradual tapering might be necessary to avoid severe physiological pushback, like caffeine withdrawal. But for some behaviors, a cold turkey jump in. Jump in is the only way to break the psychological dependency.
And the 5th tactic is the 30-day vice fast. You select one behavioral crutch, be it alcohol, social media, or refined sugar, and you mandate a 30-day abstinence.
Is that just for a physical detox?
No, the primary utility of this isn't just the physiological detox, it is the psychological recalibration. It is a forced demonstration to your own subconscious that your prefrontal cortex retains executive control. You prove that you are the architect of your behavior, not the victim of your impulses.
While those are incredibly effective strategies for subtraction, what really shifts the paradigm is the concept of addition. When we try to build new positive habits, our brains naturally resist any framework that feels like deprivation.
Oh, absolutely. If your internal monologue is, I am no longer allowed to watch television, your brain instantly fixates on the loss of the television. The scarcity mindset triggers anxiety.
But if you reframe the objective around addition, I'm going to dedicate 2 hours every evening to mastering digital photography, or I'm going to institute a complex board game night with my children, the old habit is organically crowded out. You aren't mourning the loss of a screen. You are deeply engaged in the acquisition of a new skill and the deepening of interpersonal bonds.
This strategy addition leverages a fascinating neurological mechanism known as the reticular activating system, or RAS.
The cognitive bouncer.
Yes. The RAS is a bundle of nerves at the brainstem that acts as the ultimate cognitive bouncer. At any given moment, your sensory organs are being bombarded by millions of bits of information. If your brain attempted to process all of it consciously, you would suffer a catastrophic psychological collapse. So the RAS filters out 99.9% of that data. only allowing information that is critical to your survival or highly relevant to your current focus to reach your conscious awareness.
This is the exact mechanism behind the red Honda Civic effect. If you decide you're going to purchase a red Honda Civic, what happens the next time you merge onto the highway? You see red Honda Civics everywhere.
They didn't spontaneously materialize from the ether.
They were always occupying that physical space. But your RAS had previously categorized them as irrelevant background noise. The moment you set the intention, you handed the cognitive bouncer a VIP list. The RAS immediately started pulling those vehicles into your conscious awareness.
And this is why the physical act of writing down your goals is not just a self-help cliche. It is a neurological necessity. When you define a goal with extreme specificity and write it down, you are programming your RAS. If you don't define your goals, you are functionally navigating the world blind. You will walk right past the resources, the conversations, and the opportunities required for your success because your brain does not know it is supposed to be looking for them.
But the way we set goals requires a fundamental inversion. When the average person sets a goal, the immediate question is, what do I need to do to acquire this? But the far more potent, transformative question is, who do I need to become?
The author shares a deeply vulnerable narrative regarding this shift. He was single, highly driven, and decided he wanted to find the ultimate life partner. So he sat down and wrote 40 pages detailing every conceivable attribute of this perfect woman: her ethical framework, her sense of humor, her physical fitness, her emotional intelligence.
But then he experienced a moment of brutal, clarifying self-awareness. He looked at this 40-page dossier of an extraordinary human being and asked himself, would a woman of this caliber actually want to be romantically involved with a man like me?
That is a devastatingly honest mirror to look into. It requires stripping away all ego.
It does. And recognizing his own deficits, he flipped the entire process. He generated a second 40-page document, but this one detailed the exact character traits, the emotional maturity, and the daily disciplines of the man he would need to become in order to naturally attract a woman of that magnitude.
He stopped focusing on the acquisition of the partner and entirely dedicated his energy to the transformation of his own identity.
And the result was exactly as the compound effect dictates. By becoming the right person, he naturally intersected with and married the woman he had described. Success is not a target you hunt. It is a state you attract by virtue of your evolved identity.
Okay, so let's synthesize where we are. We have established our why power. We have programmed our reticular activating system with clear goals. We are utilizing the friction of tracking to maintain awareness. And we are strategically uprooting bad habits while installing positive ones. When you string enough of these optimized daily choices together, you summon what is arguably the most formidable force in human achievement.
We summon Big Mo. Momentum.
Momentum is the invisible physics of success. It is the dividing line between those who perpetually struggle and those who seem to achieve effortlessly. Consider the structural engineering and physics of a freight train.
Okay, paint the picture.
When a massive train is sitting idle on the tracks, the absolute inertia is staggering. You can place a single 1-inch block of wood under the driving wheel and the train cannot move. The initial energy required to overcome that static friction is immense. This is what the first 3 weeks of a new habit feel like. You are burning massive amounts of cognitive and physical fuel just to turn the wheels an inch.
But once that train overcomes the initial friction and accelerates to 55 miles per hour, the physics entirely change. The momentum is so profound that the train can smash through a 5-foot-thick, steel-reinforced concrete wall and barely register a deceleration. The exact same machine that was paralyzed by a block of wood is now unstoppable.
That is the psychological state of Big Mo. When you have momentum, the obstacles that used to trigger catastrophic failure, a bad day at work, a critical comment, a minor illness become completely inconsequential. You blast right through them. Look at the rigorous consistency of Michael Phelps.
Oh, his training schedule was insane.
To architect the momentum required to secure 8 gold medals in a single Olympic Games, he trained every single day for 12 consecutive years. Over the course of 4,380 days, his coach permitted him to alter his training schedule exactly 1 time to attend a middle school dance. That is an almost incomprehensible compounding of momentum.
Or look at it applied to corporate dynamics. Apple is often viewed as a company that generates overnight technological miracles. But in 2001, Apple's iPod revenue actually plummeted by 33%. The subsequent year was equally challenging. They were pushing the heavy train, burning capital with minimal forward movement.
But they maintained absolute consistency in their innovation and design rhythms. They didn't panic and change their entire business model. They kept pushing.
And by 2005, the momentum reached a critical velocity. Revenue surged by 68%, and they established total market dominance. Big Mo finally arrived.
But we must issue a severe warning regarding momentum. While it is incredibly difficult to generate, it is tragically fragile. It can be lost in an instant. The sources utilize the mechanical analogy of a hand-pumped water well. If you've ever operated one, you know the process.
It's exhausting.
You begin pumping the heavy iron handle. It requires intense cardiovascular effort. Your muscles burn, and for a long time, absolutely no water appears. This is the valley of disappointment where most individuals quit. But if you persist, the vacuum builds, and eventually a few drops emerge. If you maintain the effort, a heavy, consistent stream of water flows.
And once it's flowing, the effort required drops dramatically. You only have to apply a gentle, rhythmic pressure to the handle to maintain the maximum output of water. You are operating in a state of flow.
Exactly. But what happens if you decide you have earned a rest? What happens if you let go of the handle for just 5 minutes? The vacuum breaks, and all that water plummets back down the pipe to the very bottom of the water table. When you return to the pump, you cannot simply apply that gentle pressure to resume the flow. You have to endure the excruciating, exhausting process of rebuilding the vacuum from absolute zero. This is why the stop-and-go cycle is the ultimate destroyer of potential.
It is the equivalent of trying to fly a commercial jet from Los Angeles to New York. If I am piloting a massive jet flying at 500 miles per hour, but I decide to land the plane in every single state along the flight path to take a break, and you are flying a small, slow propeller plane at 200 miles per hour, but you execute a direct, nonstop flight, you will beat me to New York by days.
Start-stop methodology obliterates momentum.
The vast majority of the jet fuel is burned entirely during the takeoff and landing phases, leaving nothing for the actual journey.
To prevent the vacuum from breaking, to keep the jet in the air, you must engineer rigid, unshakable daily routines or rhythms. You need structural safeguards that operate independent of your willpower. And the most critical architectural components of your day are the bookends, how you initiate the morning and how you close the evening.
Because the middle of the day is a mess.
It's inherently chaotic. You will face emergent crises, fluctuating demands from superiors, and unpredictable friction. You cannot control the middle, but you have absolute sovereignty over the bookends.
Let's examine the anatomy of a highly optimized morning bookend. The author details a routine that is remarkably precise. The alarm sounds, and he utilizes the snooze function for exactly 8 minutes. But this isn't a passive return to sleep. He leverages those 8 minutes for targeted cognitive priming.
He cycles through intense gratitude, mentally directs appreciation towards specific individuals in his life, and visualizes his primary objective.
He then rises, initiates the coffee process, and engages in 10 minutes of physical stretching to stimulate blood flow. This is followed by 30 minutes of reading highly constructive educational material. And then crucially, he executes 1 solid hour of deep, undistracted work on his most vital project.
All of this occurs before he ever exposes his brain to the reactive chaos of an email inbox.
By 7 a.m., he conducts a 15-minute calibration to lock in his top 3 most valuable priorities for the day. He has functionally won the day before the rest of the world has even finished hitting snooze.
The evening bookend is equally systematic. It is designed to downregulate the nervous system and close the cognitive loops of the day. It is analogous to a waiter cashing out at the end of a demanding shift. You must reconcile the ledger.
You review the day's execution. What protocols succeeded, what tasks require rolling over to the next day's agenda. You offload lingering anxieties or emergent ideas into a journal to prevent them from looping in your subconscious and disrupting your sleep architecture.
Finally, you read 10 pages of a complex or uplifting book. This ensures that the final data processing your brain engages in before falling asleep is constructive, rather than the cortisol-inducing panic of the nightly news cycle.
And this structural rhythm extends beyond the daily microcycles. You must engineer weekly and monthly cadences to protect long-term assets, like relationships. The concept of the rhythm register is brilliant here. The author mathematically schedules his marriage. Every Friday at 6 p.m. is a non-negotiable date night. Every Sunday at 6 p.m., they conduct a formalized relationship review, rating the week's dynamic on a scale of 1 to 10, and collaboratively strategizing how to elevate the subsequent week's metric to a 10.
You schedule the critical components of your life so you never have to rely on the fragile energy of spontaneous willpower to execute them.
Now, we must address the inevitable reality of human friction. What happens when a catastrophic variable is introduced? A severe illness, a family emergency, a massive operational failure at work? You miss a day of the rhythm. Does the water immediately crash to the bottom of the well? Is the momentum entirely shattered?
Right. If the system is so fragile that one sick day destroys 3 years of compounding, then we're building a house of cards. The psychological danger here is known as the abstinence violation effect, or the what the hell effect. A single missed day will not break the vacuum of the well. The structural integrity holds for a brief pause. The fatal error occurs when the individual misses one day, feels a surge of perfectionistic shame, and concludes, well, I ruined the streak, I might as well give up entirely. It is the consecutive missed days that destroy momentum.
Which highlights the immense danger of the New Year's resolution physiology. The individual who has been entirely sedentary for a decade suddenly decides they are going to execute a high-intensity, 2-hour workout regimen 5 days a week. They are architecting a routine based on a transient spike in motivation designing for bikini season, rather than designing a sustainable rhythm for a lifetime.
They endure the agony for 3 weeks, completely deplete their central nervous system, miss 2 consecutive days, trigger the what the hell effect, and abandon the protocol forever.
You must calibrate your rhythms for endurance. You must embrace the physiology of the tortoise, not the hare. Build a baseline rhythm that is so realistic you can guarantee its execution for the next 20 years.
Simultaneously, however, you must periodically introduce controlled chaos into the system. If you execute the exact same biomechanical workout routine for 6 months, your neuromuscular system adapts, efficiency increases, and hypertrophy ceases. You stagnate. The brain also habituates to routine and becomes understimulated. To keep Big Mo engaged, you must periodically shake it up, introducing novel challenges, altering environments, or increasing load to force new adaptations.
All right, so we have optimized our internal mechanics. We have the habits, we have the rhythms, the momentum is carrying us. But there is a silent, pervasive variable that can override all of this internal engineering. You can possess a flawlessly designed boat with incredible momentum, but if you drop it into a river with a toxic, overwhelming current, you will be swept entirely off course. We must systematically audit the invisible external forces controlling our neurology, our influences.
The human brain is not a sealed system. It is highly permeable and exquisitely sensitive to its environment. We must first audit our input, the data we permit to enter our consciousness. As we discussed earlier, the brain's default evolutionary posture is fear-based threat detection. Modern media conglomerates are fully aware of this neurobiology. They utilize algorithms optimized for outrage and fear because amygdala activation guarantees prolonged engagement.
If you're consuming several hours of sensationalized news or toxic social media daily, you are actively pouring contaminated data into the processing center of your mind. You will inevitably filter your perception of reality, your risk tolerance, and your optimism through a lens of synthetic anxiety. Garbage data in, garbage behavioral output.
But the inverse of that equation is equally powerful. Greatness in, greatness out. And the most accessible mechanism for injecting high-grade data is what the sources refer to as drive time university. Let's look at the mathematics of the commute. The average individual drives roughly 12,000 miles annually. That equates to approximately 300 hours confined within the cabin of a vehicle.
If you default to algorithmic radio or repetitive playlists, those 300 hours are cognitively dead space. But if you convert that vehicle into a mobile classroom, consuming complex audiobooks, detailed lectures, and high-level strategy, you are integrating the equivalent of a full university semester into your annual routine, utilizing time that was previously categorized as lost.
The second, and perhaps most volatile external influence is our associations. Jim Rohn's axiom that you are the average of the 5 individuals you spend the most time with is not a metaphor. It is a neurological reality. It is driven by the mirror neuron system in the brain.
We unconsciously mimic the posture, the vocabulary, the stress responses, and the ethical baselines of our immediate peer group.
Exactly. If your primary associations possess low financial literacy, poor dietary habits, and a cynical worldview, your mirror neurons will slowly, invisibly synchronize your behavior to match theirs. To protect your momentum, you must aggressively triage your relationships into 3 distinct categories.
Let's break those categories down. First, you have disassociations. These are the individuals who are actively toxic, who drain your cognitive bandwidth, and whose baseline behavior is destructive to your goals. You must enact a hard boundary and remove them from your operational sphere.
Second, you have limited associations. These are individuals you care about, perhaps old friends or family, but whose behavioral momentum is stagnant. You can allocate 3 hours to them at a barbecue, but you cannot expose your neurology to them for a 3-day weekend.
Third, and most crucially, you have expanded associations. These are the mentors, the elite performers, the individuals operating at a frequency that intimidates you. You must actively engineer proximity to these people to force your mirror neurons to adapt upward.
And we must address the intense psychological friction that accompanies this triage. Listeners are likely experiencing a profound sense of guilt at the mere suggestion of cutting people out of their lives. It feels ruthless.
It does. It feels like you are abandoning people who have known you forever just because you decided to read a few books and lose some weight.
But we have to analyze the psychology of that guilt and the psychology of the individuals you are outgrowing. Often the guilt is entirely misplaced. It is the crabs in a bucket phenomenon. When you elevate your standards, enforce new disciplines, and begin executing at a higher level, the individuals in your current orbit who are refusing to grow will experience severe cognitive dissonance.
Your progress acts as a devastating mirror, reflecting their own stagnation and fear.
To alleviate their own discomfort, they will attempt to pull you back down to the baseline. They will mock your dietary restrictions or criticize your ambition as greed. Their resistance is not evidence of your selfishness. It is a manifestation of their own insecurity. You are not obligated to drown with them.
Which transitions perfectly into the macro-level influence, our physical environment. You cannot out-willpower a restrictive architecture. The author provides a vivid example. While living in the East Bay area of San Francisco, he recognized that his immediate environment was capping his psychological potential. To shatter that ceiling, he began driving to Tiburon, an extraordinarily affluent, high-performing enclave, simply to walk the streets, absorb the architecture, and force his brain to normalize that standard of living.
He eventually purchased a dramatic 4-story blue house with a whale lightning rod in that exact neighborhood. He understood a fundamental behavioral truth. Life organizes around the standards you tolerate.
If you tolerate a disorganized workspace, a chaotic home, or a culture of mediocrity, your subconscious will adapt your output to match that low standard. If you want to force exponential growth, you must physically transplant yourself into an environment that demands it.
All right, we have reached the apex of the methodology. We have laid the foundation of daily choices. We have utilized the tracking scorecard to build awareness. We have identified our deep why power, established unbreakable rhythms, summoned Big Mo, and ruthlessly curated our neuroenvironment. We are operating at peak efficiency. But how do we shift from linear growth to exponential acceleration? How do we hit the gas pedal?
The answer lies in the physiological and psychological crucible of the wall.
To understand the wall, we have to look at the central governor theory developed by exercise physiologist Tim Noakes. When you are engaged in intense physical or cognitive exertion, there comes a moment of profound agony. Your muscles burn, your lungs heave, and your brain screams at you to cease the activity immediately. You feel you have reached absolute hard physiological failure. You have hit the wall.
But Noakes' theory, supported by extensive data, reveals that the wall is largely an illusion. The brain is highly conservative. It predicts failure and generates the sensation of agonizing fatigue to force you to stop while you still have roughly 40% of your actual physiological capacity remaining. The REL is a neurological safeguard, a negotiation, not a physical limit.
That reframes everything. When you hit the wall, you aren't actually empty. You are just at the threshold where average people decide to negotiate a surrender. The author uses his own grueling cycling sessions up Mount Soledad to illustrate this, but the ultimate clinical application comes from Lance Armstrong's cycling career.
During a notoriously brutal mountain stage of the Tour de France, the environmental conditions were catastrophic freezing rain, heavy mist, hail. The physical suffering was universal among the peloton. Armstrong was trailing the leaders. But he understood the psychology of the wall. He knew that the exact moment the other elite riders were negotiating with their central governor and succumbing to the pain was the precise moment of maximum vulnerability.
He realized that his capacity to endure suffering was his ultimate competitive advantage. In the worst possible conditions, he stood up on the pedals, attacked the mountain, broke the will of his competitors, and secured the victory.
This is the mechanism behind Arnold Schwarzenegger's cheat rep principle in bodybuilding. If your hypertrophy program dictates 12 repetitions of a heavy weight, the completion of those 12 reps merely brings you to the baseline of expectation. Every athlete in the gym completes the first 12 reps.
But when your muscles reach momentary muscular failure at rep 12, when you hit the wall and you utilize supreme psychological force, perhaps a slight shift in momentum or a spotter, to execute 3 or 4 additional cheat reps deep into the pain cave, that is the exclusive zone where exponential adaptation occurs.
Those final reps past the wall don't just add to your results linearly, they multiply them. The wall is the exact coordinate where the average majority stops, and the extraordinary minority accelerates.
And this multiplier effect applies to every facet of human interaction, not just physical endurance. It is the methodology of consistently beating expectations by a magnitude that shocks the system. It is applying the Pareto principle to effort. The first 90% of your effort just gets you a seat at the table. The final 10% of unexpected, unreasonable effort generates 100% of your competitive dominance.
Look at Oprah Winfrey's cultural dominance. During her famous automotive giveaway, she didn't just meet the expectation of giving a car to a family in need. She shattered the paradigm by giving away 276 Pontiacs to the entire audience. She exceeded expectations to such a degree that it became a permanent cultural milestone.
Or consider the author's own romantic proposal. He didn't execute a standard, expected proposal. He invested the time to learn conversational Portuguese, the native language of his future wife's father, to propose to her in a language that honored her lineage. Furthermore, he systematically contacted all 5 of her brothers to individually request their blessing. He applied the cheat rep philosophy to his relationship, generating an emotional resonance that fundamentally solidified their familial bond.
It is about identifying the standard protocol and then violently deviating from it in a positive direction, zipping when the herd zags. The author notes that while everyone sends Christmas cards, which simply dissolve into a pile of expected seasonal noise, he sends handwritten Thanksgiving cards. The sheer unexpected nature of the gesture forces the recipient to actually register the appreciation. But I have to apply some critical pushback here. Does executing the unexpected always yield a multiplied reward? Can it not cross the line to aggressive desperation?
That is a highly sophisticated question, and the risk analysis is crucial.
Because the sources detail the case study of a candidate named Alex. Alex lived in California and was desperately pursuing a high-level executive position in Boston. The corporation was conducting local interviews in person and out-of-state interviews via standard webcam. The author advised Alex to launch a shock and awe campaign to bypass the webcam expectation, purchase a cross-country flight out of his own pocket, arrive at the Boston headquarters unannounced, deliver highly researched, personalized gifts to the executive board based on their obscure hobbies, and demand a face-to-face interview.
Alex analyzed that advice, deemed it dangerously aggressive, and opted for the safe, expected webcam interview. He blended into the digital noise and failed to secure the position. But my question is, if he had executed that shock and awe campaign, isn't there a high probability the executives would have viewed him as unhinged or completely lacking in professional boundaries?
Yes, there is a probability of that outcome, and we must accept that reality. If you execute a highly aggressive, paradigm-breaking maneuver, you might alienate or offend 20% of the people who encounter it. 1 out of 5 executives might find the unannounced arrival in Boston to be deeply inappropriate.
But the critical calculation is this. You will absolutely astound and captivate the other 80% with your sheer hunger, your audacity, and your refusal to accept the default parameters. By choosing the safety of the webcam, Alex mitigated the risk of offending anyone, but he mathematically guaranteed his own mediocrity. The wall, whether it is the burning sensation in your quadriceps on a mountain or the profound social anxiety of appearing too aggressive in a corporate lobby, is not a concrete barrier designed to keep you out. It is a psychological filter designed to keep the uncommitted out.
It is a filter. I love that framing. If the wall wasn't there, the achievement would hold no value because anyone could acquire it. It reminds me of the strategy executed by the nonprofit organization Invisible Children. They were desperate to secure Oprah Winfrey's platform to broadcast the atrocities involving child soldiers in Uganda. They had organized hundreds of thousands of youth across the country, but they couldn't penetrate the corporate wall of Oprah's production company. Standard inquiries failed.
So they escalated to the extreme unexpected. Over 500 individuals mobilized and stood in absolute eerie silence outside her Chicago television studio at 3:30 in the morning. They didn't shout. They didn't riot. They presented a shocking, highly disciplined visual anomaly.
When she arrived, the sheer magnitude of the unexpected effort bypassed all her standard filters. She brought them onto the broadcast, and their message instantly reached an audience of 65 million people. They hit the wall of rejection, they refused to negotiate with it, and they multiplied their global impact overnight.
Ultimately, this is the grand synthesis of the compound effect. It is not magic. It is the ruthless, unglamorous culmination of microscopic daily choices. It is the implementation of cognitive friction through tracking. It is the rewiring of neural pathways fueled by an emotional why. It is the architectural design of unbreakable behavioral rhythms. It is the aggressive curation of your neuroenvironment. And it is the psychological willingness to push into the pain cave of the wall when every biological impulse is screaming for you to surrender. That is the actual mechanical formula for radical life transformation.
And as we bring this deep dive to a close, we have to confront the final, brutal truth presented in the source material. Intellectual acquisition without physical execution is entirely worthless. You can listen to this analysis, you can comprehend the exponential mathematics of the magic penny, you can understand the central governor theory of fatigue, but if you do not alter your behavior, this entire exercise was simply high-level entertainment. Motivation that does not result in movement is merely a sophisticated form of self-delusion.
Knowledge is not power. It is only potential power. The kinetic energy is found exclusively in the daily execution of the disciplines.
So as you move back into the reality of your day, I'm going to leave you with a final provocative mechanism to consider. Think back to that evolutionary desire we discussed at the beginning, our desperate neurological craving for instant, visible confirmation that our efforts are working. We know now that the math of success denies us that comfort. The roots must grow in the dark for 31 months. So what if the exact moment you feel the overwhelming urge to quit today? What if that specific wall of exhaustion or boredom or intense frustration you hit at 3 p.m. this afternoon is not a signal that you are failing, but the actual invisible starting line for your multiplied success? What if every single one of your competitors is stopping at that exact same coordinate of pain, and your next step, the microscopic choice you do not want to make, is the exact cheat rep that makes you untouchable? The math is running. Keep watering the dirt.